Last week we covered Zechariah. No, I did not forget it last week. Yeah, it was a couple weeks ago. I forgot it again. I'm going to have to staple it to my hand so that way we can just remember that it's always there. So luckily, and I am not in any way advocating for Apple products, but when you do something on an Apple, all your phones and everything else is integrated. So I do have my notes on my phone. I just can't broadcast them up there. So we're going to go off my notes this morning. Does it? Yeah, but Microsoft isn't cool. Yeah. But and I only say that because when I opened my own practice about 15 years ago, Apple was the only one that was doing it, so that was kind of the recommendation. So I've been stuck with them ever since. So, but today we are going to be covering the book of Malachi. And we are going to spend the next 2 weeks. So this week we're going to just kind of cover Malachi, and then we are going to talk about specifics. That's my anticipation. We may just finish it up today, depending on how much, given the way things are today. But to make things a little bit easier for you guys, if you have your Bible, or if you have access to your online source, whatever, if you want, we can kind of follow along, and we can kind of talk about the structure of Malachi and go from there. But before we begin, we're going to open our class with a prayer. We'll pray for Sue and her family. Is there anybody else, Vicki? Williams? Okay. Sure. And where are they at? In Florida? Okay. All right. Let's bow our head. Holy God, we come before you, and we acknowledge you as God. We give you praise and glory and honor that is due to you for all things. We thank you for your love for this world that you've created for us. We thank you for loving us, for sending your Son. We lift up our hearts and our minds in prayer and supplication, thanksgiving. Lord, we are in the midst of troubles. We raise up our sister Sue and her family and everything that they've endured, but we know that they have endured this because you were God. We pray for Deanna's family, immediate family, for the kids, and for her husband. We pray for the Williams family who've lost a loved one in Florida. We raise them up and ask that you cover them with your comfort and your peace. We know that your grace was unearned, and there's nothing that we can do, we could have done to deserve it, but you poured it out for us. Lord, we come before you today in this class. We ask that you open our minds and our hearts, that we take a little bit of this creation that you have given us, and that we take it in and have a better understanding of your word, of your mission for your prophets and your those who you have sent to give us this message. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity as a congregation to come together to give you praise and glory for everything. We thank you for your Son and the Holy Spirit that was promised and poured out to us at baptism. We love you. We give you thanks and glory again. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. So, um, so like I said, unfortunately, I don't have slides today, but I have notes, and we are covering Malachi. So, has anybody here ever done a study on Malachi? Like just a deep dive or anything to that effect? Or the, recent? So, let's take a step back and let's kind of get a good idea of where we're at. So, we're pretty much about 20 years, not even 20 years, 10 years after the exile. We've spent all this time talking about stuff that's been coming together. And I want to emphasize that part of this class is the historicity, the historical documents themselves. When we studied, and I'm trying to get through these classes in kind of an order in which scholars believe that they were at least initially composed. But it doesn't mean that they are completed, because as we've seen and we know from our own studies and from viewing non-religious texts, ancient documents go through a revision. Everybody changes it a little bit. Why? Because it suits their needs. It's just like these books. So the last 3 books we've covered are all prophetic, short prophetic books. Haggai, Zechariah, and now Malachi. And when we study these books even in a religious context, but in a scholastic context, one of the first questions we should be asking ourselves is, why? Why this book? Why now? And we understand these because if we take the scholastic look at it, just scholastically, when are these being written? Upon the return from exile. Where are they being written? Well, as we've talked about before, the focus of all of these books post-exile, and we notice this, and part of it, yes, is because there no longer is an Israel. There is no longer the 10 northern kingdoms, or tribes, excuse me. But the focus is Jerusalem. The focus is the temple. And again, realistically, your other books, your ancient or your pre-exile books, do focus on sacrifices in the temple. But there is no call to return. There's this overarching theme of come back to Jerusalem. But not just come back to Jerusalem. Come back to the ways that Jerusalem should be honored and be revered. Because the focus of Jerusalem is not Jerusalem itself. Writers don't really, and Jews don't really, they focus on Jerusalem, but the focus is because there sits the temple. They don't really care about, the northern neighborhood. I mean, they do. It's their homes, those who live there. But Jerusalem is important because it is the focus, it is the center of worship. It is the physical connection of God to man. God to the Jews, not just man, God to the Jews at this time. And we've talked about recently, we're starting to develop because the Jews have now really interacted with the rest of the world by being exiled and by being captured and taken out, that there's starting to be this crack in the writings where we see this call that God is not just going to save Israel. God is not just going to save the Jews, but he's going to start to consider saving the Gentiles, the faithful Gentiles, those who do revere and worship the God of Israel. Now, again, this is a scholastic viewpoint, that the purpose, the reason for that is because of their interactions. They're having further interactions with the world. It's not just Egypt, as we read in the in the ear- in the in the earlier writings. The main enemy of the Jews is Egypt, because that's where they were exiled from initially. That's where they escaped persecution. We talk about the Philistines, but that's because that's their neighbors. But this is Persia that they were taken from, or Babylon. They weren't just taken next door. They were taken hundreds of miles away. And not only were they taken hundreds of miles away, their temple, their focus was gone. So now we have to we're starting anew. And we're learning to live in the new world. Think about it. Is that really any different than what we experience nowadays? We talk about in our modern sensibilities, we talk about, the UN and global powers and global interaction in a one world government. And we look at it from a global perspective, because we understand that concept of how big this world is. Imagine their mindset. I think that's something we forget, is these are written contemporaneously for the people who are reading it at the time it's being written, and for the writers themselves. Their worldview has just exploded. They are now interacting with not just the Philistines and Ammon and these other, the Assyrians, but now we've got Persians. And as we've talked about, how enormous the Persian Empire is, the Babylonian Empire, interactions with the Near East, so almost China, if not China, interactions with India, interactions with Egypt and the Nile, all the commerce that comes up from, because when it comes up from central and eastern Africa, the Numidians and so forth. So there's this really large world interaction that they have now experienced. And you can't forget that. Once you experience it, you're experienced it. It doesn't go away. So now you have this global concept. But at the same time, there has to be a remembrance of the past and what your foundation is. So now, instead of just focusing on the sins and the issues of the Judeans, we now have a focus of not only what are we going to do now, but how are we going to make ourselves better than we were before? Because we got to start over again. And what happens when you get to start over again? You get to start over again. You get a new chance, a new opportunity to do things different, better. And anthropologically, the other bonus to this is now you have new technology. Think of it this way. Does anybody here, just raise your hand, understand the history of gunpowder? Roughly. Gunpowder is not a European invention, right? It's a Chinese invention. The Chinese have been using it for almost 2,000 years, which is about 1,200 years more than the Europeans have. In fact, there's and it's not really a well-known concept in the Western world, but there was a large battle between the Mongols and the Europeans over the recipe for gunpowder because it was so important. This is the same concept with the Judeans. They have new technologies that they were not aware of, to make their agriculture easier, to make, building concepts easier, more efficient, whatever it is. These new concepts are now being brought into the Judean world. So getting to Malachi, we have a writer who is experiencing all this. And most likely, and we don't have any real solid evidence, but given the world around him and the world that this writer is writing in, probably experienced some form of exile, whether he was an actual exile himself or whether he was a remnant person left in Israel, left in Judea, and experienced people coming back. So this is a person who is writing from that mindset. And I think it's something that in this class I would like you guys to have in the back of your head when we talk about these things. Because we have to be cognizant of the mindset of the writers and the mindset of the immediate readers when this first came out. Because our understanding of this book is based on at least roughly 2,500 years of experience and interpretation from somebody else. Somebody has said Malachi means this to my grandparents, and my grandparents taught that to me. And I'm going to teach that to my kids and my grandchildren, because that is my interpretation of this book. But we also have to understand that there was a first impression of all of these books. The first time it was read in the temple or in a synagogue or just read. Hey, Malachi Jr., can you check this out? Check it out and see what it means to you. I mean, those are the things that, at least for me, my squirrel brain, sit in the back of my head when I read these things, when I read everything. The movie, the Odyssey, Odysseus, came out this weekend. I remember the first time I was introduced to the Odyssey. I was in middle school. And that story has survived longer than these stories. These are concepts. And when that story came out 3,000 years ago, and somebody wrote it down, a guy named Homer, maybe, when he wrote it down, it may have had if it is historical to some extent, it was like, it's like reading a story about World War II or Gettysburg. We read those things, we hear those things out loud, and we're like, you can only imagine what it was like, because it really is recent. We talk about Gettysburg, it's 150 years ago. It's 3 generations. That's it. Your great-grandparents may have known somebody who experienced it or lived it or had interaction with somebody who had lived through it directly. That's it. So these writings, there's a component to them that, of course, for worship, there's a purpose for these books, and there's a purpose in interpretation. But when it is self-study, when it is scholastic study, these are concepts that should be, that could be part of that study. because it means something to them. And the reason I say all of this, I spent 20 minutes talking about this introduction, other than I forgot, those of you who just showed up, I forgot my thumb drive, so I don't have my slides today, is because the last three books that we have, or the last two books, plus this book, are really a grouping of books that are very similar. And the next couple of books that we're going to talk about are a grouping of books that are very similar to these. Post-exile, what are we going to do? How do we get ourselves back on footing with God? How do we restore the temple, the focus of our worship? So we saw that in Haggai. Very short, specific date. We can pretty much date it based on the writing itself, because it self-dates. Zechariah, same thing. Self-dated. But Haggai is actually only a couple months. That's probably why it's so short. Zechariah, well, the first 8 chapters are self-dated as well. There's scholastic differences in chapters 9 through 14, that it was probably written by, most likely, the scholastic consensus is most likely his student Baruch, who also writes his own prophetic writing, which is part of the Apocrypha. And we're going to talk about that before I forget. We're going to talk about that moving forward a little bit more. We'll introduce this concept over and over again. There is a difference between Apocrypha and pseudegraphia. And I know it sounds, you're like, huh? So Apocrypha is, there is a good idea that it was written by someone related to either the name of the writer or that it contains a solidly religiously based writing. In other words, it should have been in the Bible, but for whatever reason, the Jewish Levitical persons, the priests and those who made that decision, said, we're not comfortable with adding this together. You had a question? Oh, okay. Pseudegraphia. So pseudegraphia literally means false writing. Pseudographic writings are an area of scholastic and religious contention, in the sense that there is an expanding group of scholars who believe a number of the New Testament writings that we have are pseudographic, in the sense that it is a false author. It was not written by the person who it is said to have been written by. I'm going to leave it at that, because that'll get into a whole thing. But as far as the Old Testament is concerned, pseudographic writings are writings that really have, they're not religiously based. They're not orthodox based in that sense. Prime example, the book of Enoch. We all hear about that book because it talks about the Nephilim, and there's some other Genesis-based concepts that come from the book of Enoch. Additionally, the letter of St. Jude mentions the book of Enoch. However, it is considered pseudographic because not only is it probably not written by a guy named Enoch, or at least the person Enoch is supposed to be, but there's concepts that are mystical, almost Gnostic, if you understand the concept of Gnosticism to some extent. So for most scholars, that is considered a pseudographic Old Testament writing. Malachi is not one of those. However, are concepts of Malachi that do not quite, uh, that scholars have some conflict with, because there's some conflict in there uh, that bodes a little bit differently than some of the other immediate post-exile writings. So, giving us direction moving forward. We're going to cover Malachi, and we're going to talk about Malachi in the historical and the Christian biblical concepts. Next class is going to be, anybody have a concept of who might be the next minor prophet, major prophet that we're going to be reading? Well, post-exile. This is a quiz you all didn't know you all were going to have. Joel. That's because I've also mentioned that before, but Joel. Wait a minute. Joel's in the middle of, not in this grouping here. Well, most scholars believe that the book of Joel was at least, and we'll talk about this in detail, there is debate as to when it began, just like Isaiah. The debate is it probably began pre-exile, but it was finished post-exile. And it was probably finished post-exile almost immediately after the return, because there are some concepts, there's some grammatical things that indicate that the book of Joel had at least some post-exile concepts, because there's words that are borrowed in the Masoretic text in the Hebrew that are Assyrian in nature. And there was no Assyria in the 9th century, 8th century BCE. So it was edited at least after the exile to include some of these words. So that's a really big concept, because Malachi does the same thing, which is why people can focus on that. But again, Malachi itself, the concepts are, and it talks about the temple being reconstructed. So Joel is that. Guess where before we talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, which will be the last of this pre-exile before we really get into the Hellenistic period. And I know you all are thinking, pre-exile, Hellenistic, what the heck are you talking about? The Book of Chronicles. And the Book of Chronicles is one book in the Hebrew text. Now, Chronicles is really just a summary of 1st and 2nd Kings and Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's just a re-edition. It's like, here you go, with some updated, it's like the updated text. It's like reading the King James Version and then coming and reading the NSRV UE. Same books, little bit different editing. It's history for the modern world in 500, 450 BCE. So we're going to talk about Chronicles, and then we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, which is really the last of the historical reconstruction books. But what's important to understand, and then there's a couple other books before we hit the Apocrypha. Daniel's going to be the last, and Daniel's actually going to be considered part of, not it's part of. Daniel is written probably around the 200s. Why? Because again, the borrowing of words and concepts that were not around at 500 when the church and most non-scholastic biblical people believe it was written. These concepts, these words are not available to the lexicon, to the Hebrew writers, until about 300, 200 BCE, which is why they believe that Daniel, of the books that we have in our Bible, in the Old Testament, that's why they believe that Daniel was the last edition. Now, of course, it's edited up to times, so forth. But the reason I say that about Ezra and Nehemiah so much is because of this. What does Malachi mean? Malachi is not a name common or in use in 500 BCE Judea. Malachi literally means the messenger. Malachi, Malakia, is the concept of, and now I'm going to be looking at my notes because I want to make sure I get it right. So, Malakia means my messenger. And in the Septuagint, translated his messenger. Medieval Jewish rabbis taught that the book was authored by Ezra the scribe, who was also the writer of Ezra, and most likely, if not the actual writer of Nehemiah, when we get to it, is an editor of Nehemiah. And most scholars believe the book underwent multiple stages of redaction, so editing. The majority of its text originates in the Persian period, so around 500 BCE. The oldest portions dating 500 BCE, and there are later modifications dated to the Hellenistic period. Why? Again, because of these loaned words, these loaned concepts. There are some Greek words, Macedonian words that are, there are one or two words in it itself. So, do we have a historical person named Malachi, like we did with Haggai and Zechariah? No, not that scholarship has identified. They believe that he is a part of, the author is a part of the Levitical line. Again, boiling it down, priests and Levites are probably the few that can write full tractates, full books, and so forth, and letters. So, most likely, a Levitical writer. There is a very tied-in concept, and we're going to talk about this. I've mentioned this briefly about with Ezra and Nehemiah, because both Ezra and Nehemiah, one of the big focuses of Ezra and Nehemiah is that too many Jews have intermarried with non-Jews, and you got to stop it. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah say you divorce them, and we'll get into that in detail when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah. Malachi says you put up with them, and you tolerate it, but stop doing it. No more. Moving forward, we're not marrying foreigners. We're remaining Jews, marrying Jews. Again, scholars, most rabbinical scholars, scholastic scholars identify that the author of Malachi was also the author of Ezra, which rabbis would say is the prophet Ezra. Josephus, writing in the 60s and 70s, says Ezra died and was buried in a magnificent manner in Jerusalem. So if the tradition is that Ezra wrote under the name Malachi, then he was likely buried in the tomb of prophets, which is where the Haggai and Zechariah are traditionally buried as well. So, where do we get Malachi? Well, Malachi is found in 1:1. It says, an oracle, the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi, by my messenger. That's how it starts. And also in 3:1. So in 3:1, it also says, see, I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Indeed, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. Again, this time it doesn't say Malachi. It just says messenger. But in the Hebrew text, and again, this is why I say we get shortchanged sometimes when we can't read and we don't have the original. Because again, the original, if it was translated word for word, is very stuttered and makes no sense sometimes. But that word there is Malachi, my messenger. So, Other scholars argue the grammatical evidence leads to the conclusion that Malachi is just a name, asserting that we are no doubt in presence of an abbreviation of the name Malachiah, which means the messenger of Yah, which is short for Adonai, Yahweh. There are some scholars, based on the concepts and the way the writing works and the wording, just like how scholars identify, you know, the debates about the true authorship of the Pauline letters. There's only 7 out of them that they can identify. Anyway, identify that because that the author of Zechariah 9 through 14 is the same author of Malachi. Now, if that's true, then there's debate as to whether it was Ezra or possibly Baruch, the student of Zechariah, who most scholars believe did write the latter half of Zechariah. So, again, there's no easy, straight answer. It's easy to say there should be, but it's not. It's like our real lives. These people had real lives where things were complicated, and they didn't always fit into an easy mold, and they didn't have it just the way it was written. They were human beings, or as my kids used to say, human beings. So, let's see. Another interpretation of authorship comes from the Septuagint superscription, and I had the Greek up there. It says, and Kyrie Anglio Auton, which means, and the angels are with us, by the hand of his messenger, or by the hand of his angel. The angel reading is found and echoed among ancient church fathers. So they've taken this and said that this is not necessarily written by human origin, but that it was written by angels and given to the Judeans at some point. Again, these are concepts and ideas that we don't hear about on a regular basis, but are out there. So, how do we get to the date? Other than the overarching concepts of rebuild my temple, the second temple needs to be built, and so forth, how do we get this information from? So, the book of Malachi contains a few historical details. A clue to its dating lies in the author's use of loan words from the Imperial Aramaic term governor. For example, that word is paha. If you've ever heard of the Iranian pasha, a pasha was a king. That also comes from, there's very similar words. There's Aramaic for governor. The contemporary governor of Judah is known as your governor in chapter 1, verse 8. These concepts, these loaned words, indicate a post-Babylonian exile date of composition, so after 538. And based on this use and the fact that Judah had a king, not a governor, beforehand, remember, the royal line is gone. There is no more king of Israel. There's no more king of Judah. There never will be. As much as they like to say there was, there wasn't. Even when they were independent, they weren't. They didn't have a king. They had the Maccabees and the Ptolemies. Let's see. Additionally, since the same verse references to rebuild the temple, since the same verse references the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, the book must have been written after 515 during the Second Temple period. The author of the book of Sirach, which we'll cover, written early in the 2nd century, apparently knew of the book of Malachi, so we know that it was there at some point, somewhere between 500 and 200. Because of the development of the themes in the book of Malachi, most scholars assign it to a position after Haggai and Zechariah, close to the time when Ezra and Nehemiah come to Jerusalem. Now, another concept, and we're going to be talking about this a lot, working up to Ezra and Nehemiah. Most non-scholars would say that Ezra and Nehemiah was written almost because it talks about the building of the temple itself and what's happening. So most people will say, well, that happened probably around 500, 510, when the building is being built. Most scholars will say that you're about 60 years too early. Ezra and Nehemiah are written somewhere around 450 to 420 BCE. And we'll get into that in detail. But the purpose of that is these are really, most scholars will say Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are really the contemporaneous books. Most people rush to Ezra and Nehemiah. But these are really the books that happen right after the exile. These are the things that people are really concerned about right before the temple was built or during the building of the temple and what we're doing. Ezra and Nehemiah have this overarching concept, and they give you this entire history of what happens to rebuild the temple. These are just snapshots done contemporaneously. So we have that information. We have those concepts because these are scholastic concepts. These are things that scholars and historians and archaeologists study. So, what is the purpose of the book of Malachi? What are the themes? So, the theme is to correct what the writer sees as lax social and political and religious behavior, especially the priests. We are talking we're really kind of, this is political speech to a sense, that as we understand it today. We're criticizing our leadership. Why? Because even though the prophets have urged the people of Judah and Israel to see their exile as punishment for failing to uphold the covenant with God, not long after they returned to the land and the second temple was being built and proper worship is being restored, people's commitment to God is starting to wane, starting to get lax again. Well, why is that? Well, that really only happens for one main reason. Your leadership is failing you. Your leadership is not directing you in the right way. There's things that are not being focused on. So it's in this concept, it's in these ideas that the book of Malachi is written. So in 1:2, Malachi 1:2, okay, so Malachi has 3 chapters in the Masoretic text. Most Bibles, most Protestant Bibles and Catholic Bibles, and most Bibles, Christian Bibles, have it broken down to 4 because that's the way the Septuagint has it. So Malachi 4 starts right after Malachi 3 at 3:19. So if you had a Masoretic text Bible, you would only have 3 chapters. Most Bibles that we have 4. Again, as we understand it, most books weren't broken into chapters until much later, at the time of the writing of this. So Malachi 1:2, Malachi portrays the people of Israel as questioning God's love for them. This introduction to the book illustrates the severity of the situation that Malachi addresses, as does his writing style, with which Malachi confronts his audience. Malachi accuses the audience of failing to respect God as God deserves. A pretty common concept, I think. One way this disrespect manifests itself is through substandard sacrifices that Malachi claims the priests offer. And again, when we read into this, one of the big sections is this: we are holding back on the unblemished animals for ourselves and we're giving the blemished animals as sacrifice. And that's found basically in chapter 2. This is really the corruption. It actually starts in chapter 1, verse 6, but it goes all the way through to the middle of chapter 2. And it talks about, for example, in verse 12, chapter 1, verse 12 and 13. But you profane it when you say that the Lord's table is polluted and its food may be despised. What a weariness this is, you say, and you sniff at it, says the Lord of hosts. You bring what has been taken by violence or is lame or sick, and this you bring as your offering. Shall I accept that from your hand, says the Lord? Cursed be the cheat who has a male in the flock and vows to give it, and yet sacrifices to the Lord what is blemished. For I am a great king, says the Lord of hosts, and my name is reverenced among the nations. The other thing, and we're going to end here, the other thing is, the other big concept is fasting. So there's two other big concepts, fasting and marriage. And we'll get into that next week. But what Malachi is trying to say is, okay, we're starting to develop this priesthood like we had beforehand. The status of the temple is kind of in flux. We don't really have a good idea of the status of the temple build through Malachi, but we know that the priests are offering sacrifices. And it's really the priest's job to determine whether it's a good sacrifice. It's not Joe's job to make sure. It is Joe's job, but it's the priest's final job to say this animal is without blemish, and therefore I give it as a sacrifice to Adonai. So the priests, who are the ones who are responsible, as we talk about, as Shane preaches, it is the minister, it is the elder's job. They are the ones responsible. They're responsible for you and me. That's the burden God has put on them. Same thing with the priests. God has put the burden on them to make sure that the sacrifice, that the festivals, that the things are done the right way. And when they're not being done, what Malachi says is that's not Israel's problem. That's not Judah's problem. That's the priest's problem. And the concept starts from the top. And if the top is corrupt, then the rest of the people will be. And that's not how we need to restart our second temple period. We're starting anew. We can't start the same way we ended, which is not treating holy what is holy. As we know from Joshua, I am holy, and you will not be able to meet my holiness. And the people said, yeah, we got you, God. We'll be holy. Well, we got 1,000 years at least of probably not. Questions? We'll see you next week with my thumb drive.